Can you start by talking a little bit about what the Buddha originally taught about authority and about critical thinking, and then maybe compare that to how Buddhist institutions have codified those teachings into the various structures and hierarchies that we've ended up with over the centuries?
Yes, absolutely. This is something I think about so much of the time. And so, the Buddha is famously quoted as saying that one should check the teachings and not believe what the Buddha said just because he was the Buddha. There's this metaphor of somebody buying gold and, like, instead of just taking the word of the goldsmith, but testing and biting and melting and doing all the things to test. So Buddhism really prizes that kind of critical thinking in theory, but Buddhism evolved and developed in cultures that were very hierarchical and had strong traditions of respect towards elders and authority figures. And so this attitude really influenced the ways that we're viewed, I think, when we question aspects of Buddhism. So in a way, it can kind of be a culture clash, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish between what's Buddhism and what's culture. I just listened to an interview with Ezra Klein and Joseph Henrich, who's one of the founders, or just wrote a book on this theory in psychology called the weird theory. And weird, it comes from some researchers who realize that a lot of psychological research is done on American college students who may
Mhm.
not be typical of human psychology in general. So a lot of these broad conclusions are done on the basis of usually male, 19-year-old American college student. But how representative is that? And then they came up with this theory called the weird theory, saying that Americans or North Americans, because I think it includes Canadians too, are weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Mm.
And in terms of a bell curve of human experience, that's way off on one extreme. And so when you compare cultures, there's certain values that are typical of weird cultures, right? These Western, industrialized, educated, democratic, including, we're more individualistic.
Mm.
We like to flatten hierarchy. We believe in equality. There's certain kind of universal morals like equality and fairness and honesty. And more traditional cultures value things like loyalty and hierarchy, right? So you see this, and I've experienced this myself. When you question something the teacher says, you're seen as disloyal from that frame of reference of traditional culture, whereas that's something that we just value in, modern Western culture. We have these values of equality and honesty and fairness and reducing harm is a high value. So that helped me understand sometimes the struggle that I felt personally being very steeped in weirdness,
Mhm.
according to that, in my own cultural values, sometimes at odds with just the way that Buddhist institutions, which are still operating on different cultural values, tend to operate. So that's something that I think is really important for us to figure out. They say that when Buddhism spread to different countries, originally it took usually, I've heard academics talk about this, takes about 200 years before the form of Buddhism
Hmm.
melding with the culture of the place and some of the worldview of the, indigenous people of the place and so forth manifests. For example, when Buddhism traveled to China, it kind of merged with Taoism and became Chan, which later became Zen. So I think we're still in the early days of that transmission, really, in the so-called West. And so we have certain cultural values. We have a worldview of looking at things through a psychological lens and through the lens of Western science, for example. So how is Buddhism going to adapt culturally in a way that's going to make it accessible to the most amount of people? Because I see, a lot of very, very traditional expressions and practices of Buddhism aren't appealing so much to younger generations. And it would be a shame if these amazing transformative contemplative methods got lost just because of these cultural barriers and things that modern people find a hard time relating to, like the very rigid hierarchy and just what feels like blind obedience to the teacher and blind faith and things like that, that are, I think, are just more cultural than anything.